everyone. Welcome to The Heart of It, where we talk all things family life from a Christ-centered, Orthodox perspective. I'm Clara Bertan, and I'm so pleased to have with us again on the broadcast Archdeacon Mark Soliman with us. So welcome, Archie.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so I know we're going to have another really great conversation, Archie, and thank God we had a really great response the last time that we talked. And today we're diving into a topic that I know is on the heart of many parents and on our minds often, which is how to have conversations around divisive topics or conversations that have the potential to get sour if we're not being intentional on how to have those conversations. But before we dive into the content, I'm curious if you would do one fun would you rather question with me.
Sure.
Okay, so this one's a good one. Would you rather be chronically too early or chronically too late? So always a little too early or always a little too late?
Definitely a little too early.
Yeah.
That's this like when I go to the airport, the stress of thinking that I could miss my flight is not worth whatever 15 minutes at home. Since I'll probably be on my phone at home anyway, I might as well be on my phone at the gate and just be nice and relaxed. And and if I'm boarding with group number 5 and they call group 4. I sneak in there, I'm not going to lie. I just walk in and I act real confident and they let me in every time. So
I love that. Now, okay, and I have to ask, the wifey, chronically too early or too late?
This was we've been married 28 years, so now we're 29 almost. And so
this is a hot seat question now.
Now we're on the same page. I think she
Okay.
was a little bit more of the too late.
Okay.
And then when she saw that I was,
she came to the light.
She came to the light of what
that.
is right. Well, what do you think? Who are you? Are you a late or an early?
I should be where you're at. I want to be like a little earlier. And my husband has actually, this is an area where his gifting has moved us in a healthier direction as we make it to
there's growth
various
happening.
events. Yeah. But, I don't know. I could feel like maybe moms and women, I don't want to speak for all women everywhere, but we have a little bit more to manage and things to bring and take care of. It's just a little harder to get out of the house.
It is.
Sometimes.
It is for sure. And that's something I've learned over time. I mean, I don't spend as much time in my hair as you do, so that's
That's a good transition. All right. So today we're diving into, I think, a really, really important topic, as we mentioned, which is how to have divisive conversations. And hopefully the conversation itself isn't divisive, but perhaps the content, whatever it is that maybe our child is bringing up to us, has the potential for that tension. And what does it look like to have those conversations with openness, with love, without dismissing our child and kind of what they're bringing to the table while still standing firm in truth. And I think there's a really hard tension for us sometimes in that space. So let's start off with why it's important to actually have those conversations and why we shouldn't be avoiding that space of entering into those conversations with our children.
I mean, so the having the conversations is important because they're looking to you for guidance. They're looking to you for truth. I mean, one of the ways I heard teenagers describe that I really like is, when you ride a roller coaster and the guy puts the lockdown on your waist, the first thing most people do is they take that thing and they try to shake it just to make sure it's actually locked down. And I've heard that teenagers do that with parents, right? They take you and they pull and push against you because they want to make sure you're actually there. Right? And they want to make sure you're stable and that you're consistent. So they'll often just kind of, without, I think, consciously doing this, math, but testing you and seeing that, I can ask like this and I can ask like this. And they're going to be consistent in their answers. And that consistency, of course, is just going to come from your own conviction, right? So if you have to think of the answer every time or you're scrambling for your own North Star, then it's very hard. But it's much easier when you just sort of have your eyes trained on Christ and you want your whole family to follow you in that direction. Then I don't have to think about it as much. It's just sort of whatever's going to come out of my mouth is probably the same thing. I won't remember. have a really bad memory. I won't remember what I said 2 months ago, but they'll notice that it's the same thing. Right. And that transparency, that consistency just comes from me being the same person at work, at school, at home, in every situation, with my wife, with my kids, with my friends, with the clergy, with the Sunday school teachers, whatever the case may be, and they'll find that, that. So, and I think then those conversations just tend to go a little bit more smoothly, right?
And I think what you're speaking to is what builds trust
Yeah.
in our relationships, because there is that consistency, there's that transparency where we're being intentional about not just, approaching this one conversation as its own little thing, but it's in the context of the relationship and what we're communicating to our children about how we care about them as people. As we talk about those things, that's the basis of trust, really. So what are then some common either fears or places where we can hesitate then as parents in approaching those conversations? What like holds us back sometimes from entering into that space, knowing how important it is?
I mean, the common thing is, what if I give them the wrong answer? So there it behooves you as a parent to find the right answer yourself, to kind of know the right answer, and to just kind of feel the right answer. And that feeling of like, not only do I know what it is, or do I, like parents will ask me, what does the church say about this? And, my question back is, what do you think? What does your heart say about this, right? Because if you're presenting someone else's answer, you won't present it convincingly, right? And there'll be holes in your answer. And when someone says, well, your kid pushes back and asks a question, you're like, I don't know. I mean, that's what the church says, right? And that's just very unconvincing because you're unconvinced. And if you have to resort to that's what the church says, do what they say, or else Abuna won't give you communion, right? Which is tactics, unfortunately, parents take. Well, now you're just going to make me hate the church, hate Abuna, hate God, right? And you're still not going to win the argument, right? And so parents are constantly resorting to these kinds of lowball tactics. So, so that's what I would,
Well, and I'm curious, maybe for a particular issue or thing that's coming up where maybe a parent is a little afraid of maybe overexposure to something, maybe something that's, some of the ugly parts of our world, or some of the things that they're maybe seeing in school, or different value systems that are being introduced into their worldview. What does that look like in terms of the fear of maybe exposing them to something that they're not ready for, or we don't think that they're ready for, and how can parents manage that tension?
Mm-hmm. I mean, there's two kinds of exposure that a parent will be fearful of. I'm exposing them to the world too quickly, too soon, and I'm letting them into something they shouldn't know about at this age, and then they're going to be curious, and then they're going to start looking it up, and then I did it, okay? And then the other kind of exposure that parents are often worried about is exposing themselves, right? Parents often don't want to say, well, I messed up too, right? And they think they need to be this stalwart wall of righteousness, right? And if I'm not a good example, my kid will say, well, you see, Dad, you messed up too, so now I'm going to mess up. And so both of those are just patently false, right? As far as exposing your kids too soon, honestly, just figure out whenever you were exposed to something, right, and subtract 10 years, and that's probably when your kid's going to see it, And if I think back to like what I knew and said and heard in junior high school, it was crazy. I mean, it was everything, right? That was junior high, and these kids are light years ahead of me, So I would say I want to be the one who exposes them. That's really important for parents to do. The church should want to expose them, topics like pornography and, stuff that's going on in our communities. I want to hear it from me. I want them to hear it from me, not from some other 12-year-old boy, because if you don't say it, the other 12-year-old boy is going to tell them all about it, in the dumbest way possible. So, no, you be the one to expose them. And if it's too soon, that's okay, right? That's a better outcome than too late. When they've already, been marred by the world, right? You expose, and then they know, hey, Dad's a safe place, Mom's a safe place. They tell me about things. They're honest with me. They never lie to me. So, you be the one who exposes them to everything. You tell them about everything, and that's great. The other exposure of exposing myself, I think is underserved, and especially in in our Coptic community, sometimes I feel like there's this stigma of I can't let my kids know I've sinned. And I can't let my kids know that I have faults, and I never apologize because that would show weakness. And I think that just comes back to this management style thinking of the boss is always right, kind of pharaonic thinking, right? I lead as a pharaoh. Pharaohs lead. That's how leaders are. And that's not the way Christ led. So admitting when you make a mistake and showing your own faults and saying, yeah, I messed up too. And not even just saying it, but just being very aware of your own mess ups as a young person, right? And then that way not losing your temper when your kid messes up. I mean, like I remember just talking to this one guy, he's a friend of mine, and he just lost his mind when his kid did something stupid. And I was like, look, I was there when you did worse at a younger age. And he's like, yeah, that's true. I'm like, come on, man, like you did worse. So if you keep those things in your own head, like you're gonna have a grace for your children, and you're gonna feel like this, the what I love to say, the father in the story of the prodigal son, he didn't bat an eyelash when that kid came back. Who knows? Maybe he did something similar when he was little, right? We all do dumb things. Maybe he was a teenager and stormed off and says, hey, son, I get it. I messed up too. I was angry at my dad too, whatever. So both of those kinds of transparencies are really important.
And so then how do we navigate those conversations where there's that balance between the truth and letting our children wrestle with something where they maybe have differing opinions, or they're inundated by a worldview or a perspective that's against either our beliefs, our faith, our values, and how to navigate that well?
I mean, the way I like to approach these things, and everyone has their own approach. And I think the first thing I'll say is, you're not me, right? Not that I'm anything, but like we're all different and we all approach things differently. So there's a comfort in how I like to handle things versus how you like to handle things. And we'll see this even between husband and wife, right? Husband likes to approach things one way, mom likes to approach things a different way. Right, so I would say stay in your realm of comfort. And don't let yourself try to be someone else, because it's just not going to work well. But having said that, my approach is always much more of a listener than a talker, and I just ask questions, question after question after question. And maybe that's just my approach, as an academic. Like I look for underlying assumptions. So I just keep asking, and then when I hear something that they don't see as an assumption, I'll say, oh, is that always true though, that blah, blah, blah leads to blah, blah, blah? And they'll go, oh yeah, well, I guess it doesn't, right? And now they've generated the conversation, right? So if you've done it carefully, you can get them to wherever you want just by asking questions. And then when they say something that isn't a correct assumption, you can say, I don't think that's correct. So because a lot of times what we do is we hear them do or say something at the very end of the conversation, and we lose our minds, right? Like, how could you think that? And instead of just going backwards and saying, well, so what were you trying to do? Or what do you think is the right thing? And they'll say, well, this, blah, blah, blah. Well, so where did you hear that? And, okay, no, and then you just keep going until you follow the string along and you figure out where they went wrong along the logic. And then there's like, oh, okay, I get it. Now, given that you made this assumption, I can see why you thought this other thing. That makes sense. It turns out that assumption is wrong, okay? And so now I haven't attacked you, your actions, your thoughts. I haven't attacked anything you said. I just say, oh, you were just relying on this assumption that turns out I don't think is true. I think it's actually the other way around. And now it's not so personal. And they go like, oh, okay, I didn't realize that. Okay, well, yeah, now that you say that, you're right. Boop, 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 boop. No, it doesn't fit. So sometimes that listening is really hard to do as a parent. You just want to jump in. You want to just like fix it. You want to smother, the conversation with your own correctness. But sitting back and listening is just golden, right? Because then you become that safe space, especially, mandatorily. You can't get angry when you're asking a lot of questions, right? And your tone can't, let it go. So.
Oh, and I think that curiosity that you're speaking to helps us pinpoint exactly where our child's heart is, because I think sometimes we can even miss each other in those conversations. Like we're having two parallel conversations, and where your child's heart might be, or where they're wrestling is maybe for their friend, or not necessarily understanding why something is a certain way, versus feeling like we have to convince them of something. And I think the other piece that was brought up in what you shared for me is maybe the sense of like that we have to like speak for God in a way where we have to convince others of the truth. Like the truth in and of itself is powerful. God's word and the way that we understand how that enriches our lives and our children's lives. Like, we can just give that to them without maybe that tension of feeling like we're constantly convincing them of something. So can you speak to that posture a little bit of what happens when we're kind of in that stance of always needing our children to see things a certain way so that they're right with God, that they're right with us, versus giving room for time, for the Holy Spirit, for that wrestling in their own hearts to develop spiritually over time?
Yeah, I mean, like I think that if you pull the string on that one, it comes all the way back to what do you think your role is as a parent? And I'm personally not a big fan of the scare tactics of God will judge you for what you did with your children, and did you take them to church, and did you take them to every meeting, and did you like and a lot of parents like are very scared, and they say things that are just horrendous, like you're a responsibility around my neck, and if you sin I go to hell. And then these parents are actually scared of going to hell because of what their kids did, right? So I think when you're sort of settled that, hey, this isn't, I'm here to guide, I don't own this kid. It's not my kid, right? And when things get rough, many times my prayers were, he's not my son, he's your son. She's not my daughter, she's your daughter, right? Mm-hmm. I just have to keep him alive for 18 years, right? That's pretty much my job. But otherwise, it's their kid, it's their life, And so when you have that perspective, you're now just a lot more patient, right? Mm-hmm. Now I'm just kind of watching them bump along on their spiritual road, and I can watch almost as an outsider, and I know I sound very kind of cold doing this as a father, but I watch my kids as an outsider. I'm like, oh, okay, well, they're doing that now. Mm-hmm. I guess they made that choice, and then sometimes say, oh, what did your father in confession say? And what do you think about that? So when I'm an outsider, I give them that space, and it's easier for me to not, when I don't have that fear of driving them toward a particular
Well, outcome. And I think what you're speaking to is giving God room in their life to be able to, again, come to those truths, to their understanding of how that's intersecting with their lives in ways that are meaningful for them, because our experience is never going to mirror theirs perfectly. Yeah. And so,
And let me just push back on that, not push back, but add to that. Mm-hmm. Like when you even think about your own spiritual life growing up, how much of it was actually influenced by your parents? Like think of your own spiritual walk, how you got to where you're at. It was all these life experiences. It was these challenges, most of which your parents have no idea about. Mm-hmm. My relationship with God has very little to do with my parents, actually, right? So when I think about it that way, I realize like you're not as big of a deal as you think you are, right? You don't have as much influence as you think you do with your words, right? I think you have a lot of influence with your actions, with your own conviction, with your own stability, with your own safeness. But telling them how to be spiritual, this is their walk with God, and you're not God, right? And so you can't tell them what to do, right? God will direct that relationship. It's a relationship with Him. It's kind of like your son, gets engaged, and you kind of want to constantly tell him how to have that relationship with the girl, and you're like, it's my relationship, right? Let me figure this out, right? So God's there, and the relationship is with God. It's not a concept. It's not a relationship with a bunch of static rituals, and I need him to have this correct relationship with the static rituals. No, God is interacting. God is pushing. God is adjusting. Don't worry. He's got it. You don't have to micromanage that. Right?
Yeah. It reminds me of, you're going to help me with which church father said this, but to talk more to God about your children than to your children about God. and how we can flip the order a little bit, that we're not spending enough time in prayer on our knees for our children, and we feel like our role is to really just be a mouthpiece, that is something I know I'm very guilty of. I love the lecture. I love the space of going deep and thinking that does something more than what it really does. And yes, to some degree, it's helpful to talk about some of these things, but not nearly as helpful as we think it actually is.
Yeah, and this is just a difference between moms and dads, right? Yeah. I mean, moms talk more than dads, end of story, right? And God put us, male and female together for a reason. We complement one another. So that's important that there's both there.
Yeah.
And I think when kids are younger, mom's talking is very important and very influential and impactful. And what happens as they transition and they get older is they listen less to mom. They don't hear her, as well. And then they just kind of watch dad, And I was actually talking with someone at a couples retreat, and he just talked about how he just watched his dad. His dad said nothing. And he said, and my mom talked all the time, and I don't remember anything she said because I just tune her out. And I'm exactly like my dad in that I do exactly what he does. And so that's a very powerful, thing. And I like what you said about mouthpiece of God. Like you're not that, let God, God can take care of himself, and direct that relationship himself.
We actually have research that backs this up too, where, as our children enter into adolescence, God has created them to, at one point, leave the home and to start listening to the voices of different people. Not that we don't have influence anymore, but brain imaging actually shows that the same areas of the brain that your little 5-year-old would light up when you would speak to them don't light up anymore when you're talking to a 13, 14, 15-year-old. And that's it's the way it's supposed to be. But then what do we do with that, which I think is exactly what you're speaking to. Like, how do we live? How do we model that love? How do we talk to each other as wife, as husband? That speaks volumes to what we're trying to teach in our home. So I was talking to a youth not too long ago who actually had stopped talking to her parents because I think it was a kind of a political thing. I think there was, some differences in political ideology, we would say, and she had actually stopped. It was very sad. I'm not making light of this. It's very painful to hear that there was actually no more communication. And this was an adolescent between her and her parents over this. So how do we help parents? How do we help us to not enter into that place of defensiveness where maybe we have some valid points, we see the world a little bit differently, to the point where we're actually pushing our children away around some of these really divisive topics in our culture?
Yeah. It's the answer is just don't do it. I mean, the number of youth who have been turned off because of, let's just be frank, the Trump, rallies and their parents' position on politics, and even some clergy's position on politics, just to be honest, it's staggering, and because everyone's viewing it very differently. And like you said, there's just a lot of missing each other. But some of the things that, I remember during COVID, during the BLM protests, I mean, there were houses divided over BLM. And, I was, called to a few houses where it was warfare, and the parents would just insist on saying very racist, bigoted things, primarily because they just come from a different culture where those things are accepted things to say. So, what I would suggest is start having these conversations young, but don't have them emotionally, And I remember I used to always watch, my favorite news hours, PBS, which is a little left-leaning, but it's probably as objective as it comes. And I would, insist on watching that with my kids, and then as we're watching the 1 hour, hour of news at 6 p.m., the kind of the way it used to be done, I would pause and I would just, elicit feedback. I'd listen, like, what do you think of that? That's pretty interesting, and then get the feedback. And then once I got his feedback or her feedback, then I gave my feedback, right? And it was in that order. And then we go, oh, okay. And then we continue. And that was it. And that started this very healthy, simple dialogue where I want to hear what you think. And since I heard what you think, you want to hear what I think, because, even sometimes I'd say, what do you think? And they would talk and talk and talk. And I go, okay, that's really interesting. That's really good perspective. And I would go to hit play and they're like, wait, you didn't say what you think, right? And again, this is where you being silent as a parent is very powerful, right? Because they actually, it draws them out, draws them to you. I've had situations with my kids where they ask me, what do I think? And I will just ask them questions, my typical approach. And then in the end, I'm like, okay. And then they're like, well, no, you didn't tell me what you think. And I'm like, well, it doesn't matter what I think. This is about you. And they're like, no, what do you think? And they yell at me, like, tell me what you think. Whereas, unfortunately, a lot of households that I've been to, right, it's the opposite. Parents just 98% of the time telling everyone what they think all the time. And the kids are just silenced all the time, and they don't even realize it. And then every once in a while I'll get upset, and then I'll ask the kid something, and then the dad will respond. I'll just look at him. I go, I asked your son, and kind of embarrass him, like, I want to hear what he said. That's why I asked him. And you don't have the right to bowl over him like that. So I think, that kind of reciprocity in opinion, like my opinion and your opinion, we're the same, but they know it's not. And they respect it because it's time tested and it's wise and it's,
And so I'd love to talk a little bit more then about that balance of truth and grace, because some of the things that our children are bringing up for us, or in these really hard conversations, it really is that tension of, here's a truth, we know it's biblically sound, it's what the church has given us, where we know God's heart is, but then the brokenness in the world and the things that we see, and the different values and ways that people live out their life because of that brokenness. And I think that's where a lot of our children struggle, is like, how do they go out into the world having that tension of grace and truth? So how do we have that specific conversation, and maybe even how Christ modeled that too? Like, I'd love to talk about that piece of it as well.
I mean, Jesus said the truth shall set you free. And he said, I am the way and the truth and the life. He didn't say, let me tell you about the way and the truth and the life. He said, I am. And so when I think about what the truth is Christ, and the truth is God's love. And so after that, a lot of it is just approach, and some of the more difficult issues that we have, the LGBTQ issues and all of these type of things. We're so focused on the quick, Sodom and Gomorrah, this is wrong, this is, this is not biblical, blah, blah, blah. Whereas Christ's approach to, let's just say, prostitution and tax collecting was not to lecture and to talk about its truth, and he has a truth there, but that wasn't his approach. So a lot of times what we really, where we really miss each other is we don't disagree on the principles. A lot of times we disagree on the approach. And we disagree on the approach far more than we think we do. We think it's principle based, but really what your kids are sometimes saying, especially when you're talking about some of these more contemporary issues, is, I don't like the way you're talking. Not necessarily what you're saying, but just the way you're approaching this. Right? Because you're really coming at these people as self-righteous. And they don't have the words to say that, but you sound very self-righteous and judgmental right now. Like, let's just take the LGBTQ issue, right? I mean, when you talk with teenagers, some of you, the more, the most radicalized, very liberal, very angry at the church and at everything, when you kind of poke back into their homes, it's because their parents are radicalized in the other direction. So what you have is just a reaction to that, to their reaction. And what it's really coming down to, I mean, if you were to ask them, like, hey, is this biologically the way procreation happens? Like, well, of course not. Is this the way it's meant to be? Well, of course not. I mean, it's biology. It's obvious, right? So I don't think anyone who's taken a biology class is going to disagree here. So what are we disagreeing about then, right? What we're disagreeing about is the way you're talking about them and the way the way you want to condemn them and the way you want to pass laws against them, right? So when we start saying, you know, we need to defend the truth, or we need to talk about the truth and their divisive issues, you know, the truth is Christ and the truth is love. That's the truth, right? Is this right or wrong? That's kind of a bit of a secondary, you know, discussion to have. And the kids just absorb it. You know, they sort of just know. I don't need to give you a lecture about lying, right? The fact that your heart beats faster when you lie, you know lying doesn't feel right. I don't need to tell you, you know, the Bible says lying is wrong, and the Bible says, and Abuna said, you need to go. I don't need to do that. But what I do need to do is show you the truth in my approach to your lying, which is, you know, I get it. And you know what you did, and I'm not okay with that, right? And that's the truth, that love.
And I think that stands in such stark contrast to some of these movements that are built on acceptance, and where it feels like it is a polar opposite. So even though we're resting in truth, it's missing all the other pieces that are drawing our children in, as you're saying. And so let's dive into a little bit of what it would look like for a parent to address their child around maybe not so much divisive topics as much as it is like differences of theology, or if they're in a particular environment where, you know, some people have, you know, alternative Christian traditions or ways of being able to experience God, and maybe we ourselves haven't necessarily had that same fullness or the exposure to all the ways that people can sometimes experience God. How do we talk to our children about those things without alienating them from their friends who are Christian, but maybe for different traditions or experience God differently?
I mean, that's a great question, right? Because, you know, just by and large, we haven't grown up in a multicultural, diverse society, right? I mean, as Coptic Christians, we've come from either on the good guys, you're either good guys or you're the bad guys, right? And
it's very dichotomous.
Yeah, exactly, right? And so, you know, there's always, you know, us versus them was very, very effective, you know? And if your kid questioned his faith and said, I don't know if I believe in God, I don't know if I believe in Christianity, you say, you know, what are you going to be, a Muslim? You know, and that was enough to win that argument, right? They go, well, no, I'm not going to be that. Okay, then, you know, then you're a Christian. And everyone goes, okay. You know, but now there's all kinds of Christians, right? And I think we have to approach this very differently, this us versus them approach, where you demonize other Christian religions or other people because they're not, you know, they're not Orthodox, or they're not Coptic, or worse, they're from that Coptic Orthodox church down the street, not our Coptic Orthodox church, because we only follow this Abuna. And then we can even do the us versus them within a church, where in this, you know, in my family, we follow this Abuna, and there's, you know, two Abunas serving at the same church, and they said you have to pick a side. So sometimes we let this us versus them just go crazy. But anyway, so how do I talk about these things? Once again, it's about the truth, right? And how do I say the truth? Well, the truth, again, is really in the approach and in my actions, right? So, I mean, you know, as far as orthodoxy goes, right, my kids see me. I go to the Coptic Orthodox Church. I read Orthodox books. I listen to Orthodox sermons. Right? I have Orthodox icons in my house. I have Orthodox rituals. I fast. I attend liturgy. I go to different services. It's pretty clear what I am. Right? And so do I have to harp on being Orthodox and we're the right ones, and only, you know, heaven, help me, you know, when you hear only Coptic Orthodox go to heaven, things like that, you know, just to win the argument and scare people, it's just not effective, right? My example will tell them that I believe in Orthodoxy, right? And even if I said, yeah, I think the Catholics are right, you know, my kids will look at me and go, no, you don't, because you'd be Catholic. You obviously don't. I say, oh, no, yeah, I think Catholics are right. They call me a liar, right? So you almost can't convince them that the other faiths are right because of your actions, right? So you don't have to, you know. So what you do need to do now is, because I am so dogmatically attending a Coptic Orthodox church and that's where I go, now I have to like add grace to these other faiths. And I said, you know, one of the things I love about the Catholic Church is blah, blah, blah. Now that doesn't mean I'm a Catholic and I want them to be Catholic and the Catholics are right and we're wrong. It just means there's truth and beauty everywhere, right? And as a tolerant person who loves and is part of this multicultural, I'm not going to find the bad in the others. I'm going to find the good. And so I always point out what's good in all the other faiths. I say, you know what I love about Protestants is their fiery spirit and the way they pray, and wow, they're really, truly followers of Christ. So, and my kids don't think, oh, then I should be Protestant. I mean, that's just silliness. They're not going to think that. And I think sometimes we think that, and you'll hear, well, if you do that, that'll encourage them to be. No, it won't, right? Your example is far louder than that. Obviously, I don't think, you know, and every once in a while, like, you know, if we do go to a Protestant service or something, you know, I'll come out and go, man, those drums were loud. And that's all I'll say. You know, I'm not going to harp on them and see, we have the true faith and they don't have the true faith, and because they're emotional and we're not emotional. And they'll go, yeah, they were loud. And that's all I'll say. You know, if I say something negative, I won't go after the faith. I'll just point out that the drums were loud. So anyway, but you know, what I see a lot of is parents who are so scared. You know, like, I mean, a mom called me 2 days ago, and her son is in high school and he's part of some athletic Christian group, and they have Bible studies and they have all these great activities, and he's part of this Christian athlete group. And she's like, I told him no, and this is not us, and we shouldn't go to this. And she took pictures of his Bible and sent it to me. Is this okay? Is this version of the Bible going to mess with his mind? And I'm like, you have to relax a little bit here. Like, version of the Bible, I mean, I like to read several different translations. Sometimes, you know, you get the meaning a little better when you hear it said a different way. And languages don't, you know. So, you know, she's been taught that the other translations of the Bible come from the Protestant demons who are trying to get our kids. And I'm like, you know, this whole get our kids scare tactic is just not going to work. You're going to turn your kid away from you and the Coptic Church by what you are saying. And it's going to be your fault, you know. And I just kind of, you know, let her know this is how this ends. And this morning she sent me a picture of the Bible. I'm like, it's fine. It's a Bible. It's you know, and I looked up whatever version it was, and it wasn't the Satan version of the Bible, so we're fine.
I think in some ways what you're speaking to is, when our children see that posture in us, it really is mirroring and reflecting who God is in our life. Which, you know, if there's some pieces of that we haven't sorted out, then it very easily seeps into then how we are parenting. And I think our children are so, especially adolescents, I think are so attracted to the God who is big enough to enter into those spaces with us. And I'm hearing you say we can relax a little bit, we can enter into these conversations with a little more grace for ourselves, for our children. And so maybe as we wrap up a little bit, I'm curious what encouragement you would offer to a parent who maybe has tried to have these difficult conversations in the past and for whatever reason maybe has failed. So what would it look like to get ourselves back up again and maybe try to do things a little differently?
Stop having those conversations. Start playing football with your kid. Start throwing a frisbee. Go to the beach. Ride a bike. Have fun. Watch shows. Ask them, you know, follow them on Instagram, or maybe they don't want you to do that. You know, show them, you know, what I do with I show them stupid cat videos, you know. And when your kid wants to show you a video, you know, like the video, right? Stop having, you know, where I've got to teach this kid now, you know. Enjoy your child. You know, it's only a few years. You know, I'm on the other end of this now, where my kids are in college, and you know, these statistics of like, you know, 80-90% of the time you spend with your kid is before the age of 18, right? So enjoy the gift God's given you, right? They don't have to be perfect at 14. Let them mess up, and enjoy who they are, and don't pick out the bad parts of them. See what's good I love the story of the Samaritan woman where, Christ meets this woman who's broken and sinful and all these things. And then he just compliments her and he says, you tell the truth, and that really just resonates with her. And she goes, yeah, I do tell the truth. I am honest, and he found the one thing in her, and he gave her a compliment, right? And kids just light up when you see them. Right? See something good in your kids. So stop trying to have these stop trying to make them into Republicans. Stop trying to teach them that all, gay people are going to hell. Stop trying to have these really difficult things and just start throwing a football around with them and build a relationship, right? And model that.
And what I'm hearing you say is that it's never also too late.
Absolutely.
To enter into that place where the relationship, where we're really winning our children's hearts and not just the arguments that we're in which I think it's such a powerful place to end. And I hope that anyone who's listening, by God's grace, is encouraged by these conversations, because we really are in need of each other's prayers, that we need the grace of God to do this well and not just to enter into these spaces and feel like we're lost and alone, but that we have community. And so if you've been blessed by this conversation, which I hope you have been, please share and spread the word, and we will continue to pray for your family as I hope you are praying for ours.